Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome back.
It's great to be here with you, Jacob, and of course our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, likewise. I thought we would continue our History of Economic Thought series. We started out talking about Adam Smith and the revolution that he brought into economics with the publication of his book, The Wealth of Nations. We worked our way up through the classical economists with the labor theory of value in the 19th century, and culminating in 1871 with the marginal revolution. We worked our way up through the Austrian school. We discussed Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek and the socialist calculation debate. But I thought now would be the appropriate time to talk about really the mainstream economic thinking, and that's Keynesianism, or the economic philosophy and programs of John Maynard Keynes. And I thought that maybe the best way to do that is to put it in the context of the Great Depression, because here is where you have an area where the Austrians and the Keynesians really do disagree, especially with respect to monetary policy. And I'll just throw in that when I was taking economics, and I think probably from the first grade on up in our public government schools, we're all taught that the Great Depression confirmed the failure of America's free enterprise system, and that it was Roosevelt's New Deal that saved America's free enterprise. Well, not surprisingly, Austrians take a very, very different view of that, and we take a very different view of what brought on the Great Depression as compared to what we're taught in the mainstream perspective. So why don't you take it from there and tell us, put things in the context of the Keynesian revolution in America.
Glad to, Jacob, glad to. Let me sort of put this in this type of historical context that you were suggesting. World War I ended in 1918. As we talked about earlier, the major belligerent governments participating in the war had all gone off what had been the pre-World War I gold standard to resort to paper money inflations to finance a good portion of their respective war expenditures. When the war ended, some countries still went through inflationary episodes, the worst being the kind of thing that one saw in the great German hyperinflation in the very early 1920s. But slowly but surely, countries tried to get their monetary and fiscal houses in order, and that included a return to some type of a gold standard, even if it was not the gold standard of the pre-World War I type. In the United States, there was a post-war recession that was rather extreme. This was in around 1920, 1921. Unemployment rose significantly. Output fell. The prices of general goods and services, the price level declined. But it was a rather rapid recovery, what economists sometimes refer to as a V-shaped recession. Very steep, but a rapid recovery. Basically because in that episode, the government kept its hands off the economy. Wages and prices were allowed to find their new post-boom levels in terms of balancing supply and demand. Production and labor were allowed to resort themselves out, rebalance themselves out among different sectors of the economy, and so on. With that recovery, beginning in 1922, the Federal Reserve, the United States Central Bank, decided to follow a particular course of action. They were under the influence of a university professor at Yale University, Irving Fisher, who had argued that the two scourges of economies in terms of creating economic instability were inflations and deflations. Inflation meaning a general rise in the price of goods and services, or deflation, a general decline in the price of goods and services. That the optimal policy should be a stable price level. Stable price level would mean the market could operate effectively, but without the disruptions of dramatic rises or falls in the general level of prices in the economy. And under this influence, not the single influence, but under this influence, the Federal Reserve followed a policy of attempting to stabilize the price level, which, if you look at the government statistics, the wholesale price index, the consumer price index, etc., was rather successful from 1922 into 1928-29. Now, this coincided with a period of an immense economic prosperity. We often talk about the high-tech revolution that occurred with the emergence of the computer and laptop computers and desktop computers, and then the cell phones, beginning in the late 80s and into the 1990s, and then into this century. The equivalent occurred in the 1920s. We had a high-tech revolution. This newfangled contraption became widely available because of mass production, the automobile. Electrification was basically spreading all across the United States. Obviously, there had been electrical lighting and heating in urban areas for a while, but the 1920s saw the dramatic increase of electrification of rural areas of the United States as well. Electrification also saw this dramatic increase in consumer and household technologies, the vacuum cleaner, the washing machine, all of which were huge improvements on the labor-intensive efforts to do cooking or cleaning in the household. There was also a dramatic arrival of other things. The supermarket with processed canned foods. Now, all of this sounds, sort of mundane to us, but this was all new in the 1920s. So you saw this dramatic increase in the technological innovative basis of the U.S. economy. You saw this significant increase in the varieties and the qualities and the outputs of goods and services available to the consuming public. You saw standards of living rise significantly across the board, more or less. And all of this was accompanied by stable prices, neither an inflation of rising prices nor a deflation of falling prices. So everyone viewed the 1920s as this period of great prosperity with both growth and price stability. Then, of course, in 1929, late 1929, occurred the Great Crash in October of 1929, which then began to snowball in 1930 and 1931 into this, by historical terms, catastrophic decline in output and prices and financial collapse. Unemployment reached by late 1932, early 1933, as measured by the government, approximately 25% of the American labor force. Agricultural production fell between that time, 29 to 33, by about 40 to 45%. Industrial production fell dramatically. International trade collapsed. The real imports and exports of goods and services declined by almost 50% between 1929 and 1939. 1929 and 1933. At the same time, the bank system imploded. It's estimated that around 8 or 9,000 banks in the United States went under. That is a lot of people's savings and checking accounts. Many people lost everything they had accumulated from their earnings in this financial collapse. There is no doubt about it that this was a financial and economic catastrophe that had not been seen for well over half a century, certainly in the United States. The question is why? Why? Why did it occur? Why was it so intense? And why was it taking so long to bottom out and for a recovery to start occurring? Now, the Austrian economists, of which Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek were the most prominent, but not the only ones, developed a theory, particularly Mises already before the First World War, a theory that if booms and busts occurred, it had to do with central bank manipulation of interest rates. Interest rates are a market price. They're meant to balance people's desire to save with other people's interest and willingness to borrow, particularly for investment purposes. And therefore, interest rates bring supply and demand into balance for saving and investment, just like all other prices. And as with all other prices in markets, if prices do not correctly reflect a balancing between supply and demand, there will be imbalances and distortions that can have various negative effects. In this case, what the Federal Reserve had done is that to try to keep prices stable, they had manipulated interest rates in a particular way. Because the U.S. economy was growing so significantly, the quantity of goods, the variety of goods, the quality of goods, the introduction of many industrial and manufacturing cost efficiencies that were lowering the cost of production that otherwise would have enabled more output to be sold at lower market prices, threatened with the danger, as measured by their statistics, the danger of price deflation, falling prices, even though it was based upon this natural economic growth and cost efficiencies. The Federal Reserve more or less kept increasing the money supply from 1922 to 1928. Not at a steady rate, not always at the same amounts each quarter, each year, but basically preventing the general level of prices from declining, because this was the defined falling prices as an indication of economic distress. But the only way the Federal Reserve could do this was to inject the money supply changes through the banking system. The banks found themselves with greater lending reserves. How do you attract people to buy more of any product? Well, a major way is you make it more attractive to do so by lowering the price. For the banks, this meant lowering the rate of interest. And this meant that you now began to see an imbalance or a distortion between people's real savings decisions in the economy and the rate of interest reflecting how much money the central bank had created on top of real savings to try to stimulate investment and other spending to prop up demand and therefore prevent prices from falling. The nutshell is that the 1920s, beneath this surface, this veneer, if you will, of economic growth and stability because of a stable price level, the Federal Reserve was creating this huge imbalance between savings and investment in the economy, because it was necessary to pump enough money into the economy to prevent prices from falling, but that required a rate of interest lower than the rate that would have balanced the amount of demand to borrow with the amount of real savings in the economy. The upshot of it was that this created, beneath the surface of a stable price level, misdirected capital investment, misallocations of labor and resources, the emergence of a stock market boom, a real estate and housing boom, the most dramatic of which began in the early and mid 1920s in Florida, big housing boom in Florida. And then finally, all of this came down as a house of cards in 1928 and early 1929, basically because the Federal Reserve had been pushing the money supply up so much to try to prevent prices from falling that finally their own price index indicators in mid and late 1928 were showing that the absolute level of prices were starting to rise. So they sort of slowed down and then finally stopped the increase of the money supply in late 1928 and early 1929. And this meant that the investment house of cards that had been brought into existence and had been temporarily made sustainable by this vast monetary expansion made available for lending and reborrowing purposes in the financial markets finally imploded, with the dramatic case being the stock market crash in October of 29. But then it all started coming down. But it got worse and worse and worse. We had gone through recessions, even depressions in the past, and they could seem rather severe in their initial collapse. But there were these recoveries, and they usually didn't take too long, 6 months, a year and a half. But this is now 1929, 30, 31, 32, now into 1933, and nobody knows where this is going to bottom out. Now, why had this been made this severe? One way of understanding this is the policies that were injected into the system, the economic policies of the Republican administration led by Herbert Hoover, who had come to power in the election of November of 1928 and had taken office in early 1929, just before all of this financial and economic hell broke loose. Now, the image that is often portrayed of Herbert Hoover is that he was a hands-off kind of guy. Oh, you see, he was the old school of laissez-faire. He didn't do anything, and he allowed the economy to just fall into this abyss from which there seemed to be no bottom. But the fact is that this was exactly the opposite the case. He was an extremely interventionist and activist president. He tried to jawbone, as the term came to be called later, businesses and labor unions not to adjust prices and wages downwards, to try to rebalance them given the post-boom supply and demand conditions in various markets across the economy. He said, no, keep wages up, and don't lower prices, because high prices means buying power among the workers, and buying power among the workers means that they'll have the money to spend to bring about a recovery. Well, the problem is if the demand for your product is falling, and you try to keep your wages high, you're just going to be creating a huge gap between the revenues you're earning and the costs that you have of producing, which makes it necessary to then let more workers off and more workers off and more workers off, with the unemployment snowballing in this fashion. Also at the same time, in 1930, Congress passed one of the worst tariff bills, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which basically raised import duties on foreign goods to almost historically unprecedented heights, which then with the depression setting in, other countries decided to retaliate against the United States. So everyone began following what was called a beggar thy neighbor policy. Keep out the foreign goods to try to protect demand for the domestic producers. But of course, that meant that all the import and export sectors of these economies began to implode at the same time. All of this, therefore, this interferences with wages and prices, the destructive effect of historically high tariff and trade barriers by us and other countries, the running of budget deficits, and the raising of taxes, both of which Herbert Hoover did, all exacerbated the accelerating depth of depression. Now, we can't, because of time, discuss what were the counterparts in going on in Europe, in Great Britain, in France, and in Germany, but all of them had their variations on this, and particularly in Great Britain, because that environment set the stage, as I'll explain shortly, John Maynard Keynes' views about the causes and cures of the Great Depression, which became the basis for the emergent Keynesian economics. Now, this resulted in people wanting to reject Herbert Hoover, and understandably, everything that went wrong was viewed by him. And of course, who was the Democratic Party candidate that was put up against Herbert Hoover's reelection in 1932? Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, this was going to be a relatively easy task for the Democrats. People would say things that the Depression is hoovering over us. I live in a Hooverville. That means unemployed people who have lost the ability for a home or an apartment now had to live outside on the streets and in cardboard boxes under train trestles. And these were known as the Hoovervilles. Or the poor fellow who didn't have the 10 cents or a quarter to sleep in a flop house overnight and had to sleep out on a park bench. And how did he cover himself from the cold in winter? He covered himself with a Hoover blanket. Those were newspapers. I mean, there was no way that Herbert Hoover was going to be reelected. Now, what did Roosevelt do? Okay, what did Roosevelt do? I know this is going to come shocking to you, Jacob, but Herbert Hoover ran on a Democratic Party platform that would have resulted in you going out and actively campaigning for him. Yes, even Jacob G. Hornberger.
You're talking about Roosevelt or Hoover?
Roosevelt.
Yeah, you said Hoover. I think.
Oh, sorry, Roosevelt's platform. What did Herbert Hoover run on? Well, they're so interchangeable at one level. But what did Franklin Roosevelt run on? The government is too intrusive in state affairs. It doesn't respect constitutional federalism. The government is spending too much and taxing too much, and it has to get its budget in balance by cutting both taxes and spending. It needs to stimulate international trade by getting rid of these counterproductive and harmful trade barriers. And the United States has to be on a sound monetary system, a sound monetary system of a gold-backed currency that the government doesn't interfere with. Well, it seems to me that you would have been the first one to contribute to FDR's campaign. Yes, if you had been around. Now, of course, that meant that it really didn't matter what FDR said, Hoover was going to lose, and Hoover lost. Now, when Roosevelt took office, and back then the president was inaugurated in March, not in January, he then introduced what are known as the New Deal programs within a series of months, the first 100 days, as it's called. Among the major ones were the National Recovery Administration, The National Recovery Administration was basically modeled after Mussolini's fascist state. Businesses and enterprises were not nationalized, but all American businesses and enterprises and retail stores were forced into government-mandated cartels, and a code of government insisted on prices and wages. The government introduced huge public works projects with massive deficits that made whatever Hoover had done seem like a balanced budget in comparison. And there was this active campaign to arouse the sympathy and the support of the population. Businesses were expected to have the image of the NRA codes, the National Recovery Administration Code, which was the blue eagle, a blue eagle on a white background with an industrial bolt in one claw and a lightning bolt in the other claw. And businesses, retail businesses as well, were expected to put like stickers of this in their storefront windows with the phrase, "We do our part." We followed the government's lead in controlling production, prices, wages, the direction of the economy. This was then done with the agricultural sector, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Government basically began telling farmers that what products they could, farm products they could grow, how large their animal herds could be, how many pigs you could have, how many herds of cattle you could have, and so on. So basically, the country was put on this massive envelopment of a fascist type economy, which of course was supposed to help the economy, but except for the particular immediate jobs that government public works helped to create, really had no positive impact on the economy. And I just should say, if I can just add on this, this was like a huge propaganda campaign. At football times, at halftime at football games, blimps that would be circling the football fields would take photographs, with the old reel-to-reel movies of that time, of how during the halftime the people would come out on the field and make the image of the blue eagle. There would be propaganda parades to gain support. One can find some of these on YouTube, including one with the old singer Al Jolson, who said, he'd walk a mile for one of those smiles of his mammy. And you can see one of these old government propaganda films in which a reporter sticks a microphone in Al Jolson's face. And he says, "Well, Al, what do you think of the New Deal?" And Al Jolson says, "The New Deal? The New Deal? The New Deal? That's better than my wedding night." Of course, that's when wedding nights used to mean something, if you know what I mean there. But anyway, we won't go there. Anyway, but this was a huge propaganda. They had literally Shirley Temple doing song and dances in government propaganda movies. They had Ginger Rogers from the Ginger Rogers Fred Astaire movies singing "We're in the Money." The government had monetized silver to create a silver-backed inflation. We're in the money. I mean, this was a huge propaganda campaign. They even had Jimmy Durante doing these too. But anyway, I digress. So what you had was first a crash in the economy, Herbert Hoover's anti-recovery policies, then the envelopment of the U.S. economy with basically a planned economy structure modeled more or less after the template of Mussolini's fascist economic system. And of course, things didn't get better. Yes, if government just creates money or borrows money and hires people to build roads or work on the Hoover Dam and something, obviously some jobs will be created in that direct sense. But the fact is, in terms of a normal and healthy and real recovery of the economy, it didn't. And in fact, contrary to the historical interpretations that the little kiddies learn in school, Franklin Roosevelt did not end the Great Depression. The Depression went on more or less throughout the 1930s. In fact, in 1937 and 38, after his own reelection in 1936, the economy went into a new recession, and it was even called by the media and others the Roosevelt recession, because even before recovery had occurred, the economy fell back into another recession. And throughout the 1930s, unemployment never fell in the United States from the double-digit range of between 10 to 15% of the workforce. Now, the political and ideological climate of this time was not going to be susceptible to the arguments in the case for free market solutions, the kind that Mises and Hayek made. Mises and Hayek basically argued, Mises in Vienna, in his native Austria at that time, and then Hayek, who had come to the London School of Economics in 1931 and was there until after the Second World War. They argued that government monetary mismanagement had caused the conditions that set in stage an artificial boom of the 1920s and then the great crash of the early and mid-1930s. And that what was needed was for government to get out of the way. Markets had to be allowed to be open and competitive and flexible. So supply and demand across the board in different ways and to different extents and degrees in each of the markets of the economy can be restored to balance through wage and price adjustments, the writing off of malinvested capital, a reallocation of other resources and labor to restore balance and coordination and the potential for recovery and growth in the economy. Unfortunately, this was an ideological time, a political time, where the ideas of the left, and by the left I mean both fascism and communism and socialism, were dominating the scene. In Europe, you had the rise of the fascist movements in first Italy and in Germany. The Soviet Union, having come to power with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, was espoused by many people as a model of central planning and government direction, where everyone has jobs and employment and prosperity are assured. And it was viewed that the market economy has failed and market solutions were the wrong direction. And that was the setting in which now another thinker who was well known in Great Britain already, but soon began to have an almost unbounded international reputation, came onto the economic policy scene, and that was John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes was born in 1883. He died of a heart attack in 1946. He was the son of a professor of political economy at Cambridge University, John Neville Keynes. He went to Cambridge himself. He graduated with high honors. He then ended up working for the British government during the First World War. He became famous at the end of the First World War for writing a book in 1919 called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, in which he said that the victors, especially Great Britain, France, to the United States, Italy, they were all determined to impose a victor's peace on the defeated. Germany was the only one guilty for the war. Germany's territories were to be annexed by surrounding countries. Germany, having been the cause of the war, should bear a huge financial reparation payment as to pay back the victorious countries for damage done to their peoples and their territories. Keynes basically said that the imposition of these vast amounts of reparations, far beyond he interpreted, beyond Germany's real economic ability to pay year after year, the humiliation of the Germans in claiming that they were the only ones responsible for the war or had only done barbaric things in the war. All of this, he said, was going to create a psychology and a social and political environment in Germany that will result in a demand for revenge and restoration of German greatness, and that Britain and France should have followed the type of peace that the victors followed against France and Napoleon after the defeat of Napoleon in 1815. That is a peace of reconciliation and an attempt to restore the defeated nation as a member of the community of nations for a post-war period of harmony and reconciliation. And he said that's not what the British and the French are doing against the Germans in the post-1918 period. This book was a huge success. This got him international fame, that the British and the French were squandering the possibility of a real peace following the First World War. Now, of course, that got him attention to begin with. Of course, in the 1930s, with the rise of Hitler, and Hitler saying that we must revenge for the peace treaties of the First World War, he seemed to have been like this great prophet. Also, in the 1920s, he began writing a series of books challenging the rationales and justifications for a free market economy based upon the gold standard. One instance of this is that in 1923-24, he published a book called The Tract on Monetary Reform, in which he said governments had a choice. They could control the monetary system to keep domestic prices stable with a fluctuating exchange rate between the British pound and other currencies, or they could keep the foreign exchange rate of the British pound constant and allow domestic prices to rise and fall to adapt to international conditions. He said that the goal of governments is to maintain a level of prices that assures employment and prosperity. And therefore, we had to do away with the, as he called it, the barbarous relic of gold, which tied the hands of central bankers from having the discretionary policy to manipulate money to influence prices, and for governments to give up the idea of a gold standard and its link to a currency in terms of fixed exchange rates between the British pound and other currencies. This then became his mantra, particularly with the coming of the Great Depression. Now, in 1930, 1931, 1933, he starts putting out pamphlets and small books in which he says is that the only solution for the Great Depression is huge budget deficits, public works projects. The private sector has failed. It is not providing the means and the methods to restore prosperity and employment to the British economy. And therefore, the government has to actively run budget deficits, break any remaining links with the gold standard, and take the lead in generating employment, output, and prosperity in the face of capitalism's inability to do this. All of this culminated with his 1936 book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. A lot of people who talk about the Keynesian Revolution and its influence on government policies in the Great Depression, in a sense, confuse a timeline. Keynes's book did not come out, that became sort of the Bible for the emerging Keynesian Revolution, did not come out until 1936, midway into the 1930s. The Great Depression, as we saw, began in 1929 and 1930. What Keynes did do before that book came out was to basically espousing the policy prescriptions, deficit spending, government public works, inflation, domestic inflation, staying off a commodity standard like gold. He had been arguing for all of these policy prescriptions throughout those early years of the 1930s when the Depression was going on. What the general theory did was for him to present in a book form his theoretical framework, his assumptions, the conceptual template to justify and rationalize the reasonableness and the necessity of those policies. And from that point on, the Keynesian Revolution took off.
All right. Well, that's an excellent exposition of the background leading up to Keynesianism with the Great Depression and what was going on in the Roaring Twenties. But we're about out of time. But it seems to me that it would be helpful to continue this discussion in the context of some of the things you've mentioned, like the gold standard. What that really was. What was so different about the America of the 19th century that did not have a central bank, that had no Federal Reserve, compared to the America of the 20th century, which had a Federal Reserve starting in, I think it was 1913. And then put that in the context of what happened during the Great Depression, the exact role that the Federal Reserve played in that, how a gold standard would have operated then without a central bank, and then what Roosevelt actually did with gold. We still have to get into that, and then what happened in the United States after that with respect to monetary policy, the dollar, fiat paper currency, and so forth. So why don't we start with that next time?
Absolutely. And then perhaps to give the viewers and listeners a little bit of an overview of what is the actual framework, the ideas, the theoretical concepts in Keynesian economics, why Keynes argued for these things, and why a market economist would see fundamental flaws in both the logic and the factual basis of them.
That'd be great. And then we can maybe get into Hayek's concept of money with respect to the denationalization of money compared to the gold standard. So why don't we discuss all those things in the next segment?
Absolutely.
All right. Until next week, we'll see y'all. Thanks for tuning in. So long.